In this video, what we're going to do is look at a worked example, nested loops and if statements. So let's have a look at a problem here. Allow a user to enter the numbers which are added to an array, so the size of 25 and all the values are initialized to 0. So let's just start there. So we need basically an empty array. So instead of a get size, we're just simply going to specify it's 25, and we're going to build our empty array. That's really essentially all we need to get started with. Okay. Now what's useful from the previous supplementary video is that I had a populate array and I had a display array. So hopefully with a little bit of effort we can edit these to make them work. So it says only add a number under the following conditions. If the number is not already in the array, let's take one at a time. So basically, I want to have a different populate array. If you look at populate array, it simply asks them one at a time. It has no condition. You enter the number and then it simply adds it. So I need some kind of condition inside here to check. So let's try to break the concept down, and rather than just put lots of if statements in, let's try to build a little function or a method to do that job for us. So let's come back to the concept of what we're trying to do and see how we would do it. If the number is I'm just writing this down, a number is not already in there. Okay, now for some of you, you might realize that that all instantly requires some kind of checking. So let's take my sheet of paper and let's just talk it. If the number's not already there, so we're assuming at this stage we've got, say, a populated an array, okay, and it's got some values which the user has, well, maybe not fully populated. That would probably be more accurate. It's got some gaps. Okay, so it's partially populated. Just to help us work out, now I get an integer from the user, and so let's call that temp. Okay, so the user gives me that. What I really need is a loop, and I need a loop which goes through and checks it against every single value, and if it's already there, it won't add it. If it doesn't find it in any of the values, then it will allow me to add it. Now, if you look at the question and the issues I've said before, if we enter another loop inside here, we'd have a loop here and then a loop inside here, then if statements, it gets way too complicated. So a better strategy is take the concept and build the concept. So in order to do that, that's the end of the populate array. In here, I'm going to call this, give it a name. What's the concept of what we're trying to do? Well, we'll call it public static, and later on we're going to drop the static word once we start properly building objects inside separate what classes outside of this location. But anyway, and we're this method is to do a simple thing. It's to simply take an integer value, take the array, check it's not already in there, and give me true if it's okay to add one, and false if it's already if you shouldn't add it. Okay, so instead of a void, I'm going to put Boolean here. So it's going to return a true or a false, and I'm going to have, what's the concept? It's check value is not, I'm just going to make a long name, okay, just to get the concept clear, and don't worry, is not in array. Okay, so that's the concept, rather lengthy name. Let's work out what we're going to pass it. For it to check, we need to pass it the value. So we'll call it int a value to check, or key would be a better term, right? And then we need to also pass it the integer array, because we need it to go through the integer array as it's currently populated and check if that's in there, depending on the condition. So we need a looping, and as before, we just use the loop for every single item. And do that. Let's get rid of that, pop that into there. Okay, so what are we doing? We get the loop, we'll be able to get hold of each value through the index position, and we need to do a comparison. So the comparison is between the key and this value here. Now, there are going to be some technical questions that you'll have, but bear with me, and we're going to get this done in simple stages and you can correct. We need an if statement. And if that's true, actually, let me pause there and ask you a simple question. If you find it in the array, you don't need to search anymore, and you can just leave this particular function. You said, I found it, don't bother adding it. Okay, so I need this to return as soon as it finds one. So we want to know under what condition, what's the question we need to ask for it to return true? Well, for it to return true, the key is actually matches the index. It's the item at that index, shall we say. Right, so there's the index value. Say it picks out 0. It then checks it. If it finds it, well, then you can't add it. So let's just return straight out from there. Return from this function. You found it. Okay. Now that doesn't cover every scenario. That covers only if I find it. I don't want to put an else in here. What I want to do is I want to say if I go through my whole loop and I don't find it matches and it hasn't returned true, I want to come to the end of my loop. So click that. That's the end of my loop. And outside of my loop, I want to return false, i.e. I didn't find it. Okay. Now you might want to think about the logic of which way around you want to do it. So I'm returning true if it finds it. But this says is not in array. So actually then you need to think about which way around will make more sense to you. I'm going to reverse that, and perhaps that name isn't the best one. So if it's not in the array, if that's true, then it's not in the array. If it's false, then it's in the array. Right? So maybe that name should be changed to, is in array. Now you might wonder why I would spend time lingering on this type of question. Well, it's quite crucial to get your logic right and to make your code as clear as possible to you. Let's not have all this empty white this space here. Right, so if I call it check values in array, if I find it, I return true. If I don't find it and I've gone through the whole loop, then I return false. Let's use it. So we come back up here in our populate array, and you can create a new populate array method. You can do this. We have our if statement here, and we say if check value array, we'll work out what to pass it. If that returns true, then we're going to add the item. And that's the only condition we care about. So there's your temp, which is the key, and there's your integer array. So let's have a look. I have managed to take that complex process, taken the mechanism, but given it a name, the concept, check the values in the array. So temp, let's check if that value is in the array. It's clear what that's going to do if we've got the internal mechanism right. That gives me true, then it's in the array. Is that right? If it's in the array, then actually I've done that bit wrong, haven't I? Think about it. If that returns true, I found it, so I can't add it again. So actually I want to say if it's not in the array, and I use the exclamation mark at the beginning as a way of saying not. I think the best way to work on this is to test it out. So let's run it. We think our logic is sound. We'll find out in a second. See if our syntax. So let's enter an integer. Okay, so this is going to ask for 25. Now, straight away when I'm testing it, I don't need to test it for 25. I just want to test it for, say, 3. If it works for 3, it should work for 25. Otherwise, I'll be ages just inputting values. Okay, so let's just run that again and see what it does. Please enter an integer. So I'm going to enter 2. I'm going to try and enter 3. And then I'm going to try to enter 2 again and see what it does. Well, it sort of worked. Only let me have 1, 2, but it did not. It left the last one as a 0. One thing you should notice is that when it creates this, it defaults, it populates them all with a 0. So that's not quite right, but it hasn't let me add a second one. So the logic here is not quite full. You look at what the problem states. if the number is not, only add it if it's not. So actually I'm waiting for another number. And the problem is that if it adds it, that's fine. But otherwise I need to actually do something like change the index value to stop it from leaving the loop, right? Because it's already moving along. So I need to try a mechanism either to take one off the loop or do something to stop it from just simply carrying on, because that's all it's done. It's not added it, but it's just carried on inside the loop and tried to populate it. Try to populate each particular element. Now, I don't know. So there are several ways we could do it. Now I'm going to try it conceptually, think it through. If it's the case, then add it. But if it's not the case, I don't want it to loop back round and go to the next index, because that one is empty. It hasn't populated it. So I actually need to do something to reverse this step upwards. I could cheat and try something like this. Create an else statement. So if the value is in the array, then clearly I want to give the user, force the user to do it again. So let's take one off the index. Right, so when it comes back round, the index hasn't incremented. It's tried to, but this has removed that, cancelled that action out, and allows you to re-enter it. So does that solve the problem? Let's test it out. Run it. So let's take 45. Let's take 56. Remember, it's only 3, so I'm now going to try 45 again. It's asking for an integer. It hasn't told me why, but it clearly is trying to. If I try 46, there we go, 45, 56, 46. It clearly is not letting me put duplicates in. What's missing from here is it's not explaining why. You might want a print statement in here, in your else statement, to clarify to the user, and this is an important point, I would say. You might want to put a print statement and say that number is already in the array, okay, for example, and put a semicolon at the end. Run that. Now it might be clearer to my user whether, well, why I'm being asked if I've only expecting 3. So if I say 34 and I try it again, that number's already in the array. 45, try it again, 45, that number's already in the array. So 56, and there we go. So that, through this populate array, through this check value as an array method, I've managed to try to keep the complexity down here. You know, some people might think that actually logically there are other ways of chopping this. Absolutely there are. This is just one way. This tends to break it up on the concept basis. That's what you're trying to do, the check the values in the array. Now, the other advantage of this is that you could reuse this concept in many other different ways. So let's have a look at the exercise and see where we've got to. So if the number's not, we've done that. If any combination of previous added together do not generate it. Now that's a complicated one. If any combination multiplied do not generate it. Now that is quite an interesting one. So combination of previous numbers added together do not generate it. So if you've already got 1, 2, and 3 and you want to add 6, you can't, because that combination will block it. Okay, so that's quite an obscure one. Can you see how you might do it? Well, what I would instinctively do is grab one of these methods, make a copy of it, and get the concept right. So what are we saying? We're saying check combinations summed not equal to, something like that, right? So there's the key value that we don't want it to be equal to. There's the array. Now I need to go through my array and add everything up. So actually a simple sum of everything that exists there would probably be a good concept. So let's make another method, and you'll start to notice, and that's going to return, and let's just call this sum. And the point is that by logically splitting this up into the concept of what we're trying to do, simplifies your code. So in the sum, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a loop, same loop, go through the whole array, and then just add it all up, right? So int and we'll call this I. It doesn't matter what value for the time being. Stick my loop in there. Oops, pop my loop in there. Make sure the beginning and end are correctly done. Inside here, I equals whatever the integer array. So what we're going to do is it's called a plus equals integer array, and in there we take the index value. What that is going to do is it's going to simply sum. It's going to take whatever the current value is, add it to what's in there. When it loops around, it will just keep on doing it. When we get to the end of the loop, we want to return I, which is the sum. Okay, that's just that. So we've got a little function here. So we want to check the combination is not equal to the sum. Check that. So if you look at the logic of what we have here, what do we have here? If the key we had is not the same as an item we had to return true, what happens if we, maybe this is not the best place to put it, but we'll see. If the key is not equal to the sum, we can use that function we've created, pass it the integer array already. So we're saying if the key is equal to the sum, i.e. if you add the previous numbers, it's the same, then we return is, and I put not equal to, so that actually needs to be false. If that doesn't equal true, look at my logic, pause the video, go through, make sense of it. Let's get rid of some of this space so you can see it, right? So I've got something called check combination summed not equal to. I run it, I pass it the number, it uses my little summing thing, and you notice how by breaking up code into these smaller functions helps me manage complexity and give me some kind of reusable scope here, right? So I don't have to have loops inside if statements. That's going to sum all the current values. It's going to say, is it the same as the key? If it is, return false. Otherwise, return true. So let's just use that. So we come over to our populate array somewhere, right? If that is, if the value isn't in the string, that's the first thing we're checking, right? So then we want another else if statement here. And if I spelt that right, else if, and the condition here, and what we're going to do. Okay, so this will check if it's already in there. If it only if it's in there, it's going to pop it in there, right? This is going to check if the sum of the previous isn't. So we take temp. If temp is equal to, where was it? Where check combination sums not equal to, rather lengthy name here, right? Actually, no, we don't need to do an equal sign. We just need to say, and the values are temp and int array. So let's just work out what this says. This is going to say if they're not equal to each other. If that's true, then we should just add it. Okay. I think that logic is the right way around. Let's just check our thing. Now notice what I'm focusing on is the logic. This populate array method, although it's getting more complicated, uses these sub methods to capture the point of the complexity and narrow the complexity down. So if I've got the mechanism wrong, if I've typed some of this stuff incorrectly, that's one issue which I can work out. But if I've got the concept wrong, that's what this is doing, right? And there should really be a space in there. That's why it hasn't done that. Okay, so it's checking. Is it in the array? If it's not in the array, that's fine. Add it. Otherwise, check the combination of all the previous values don't equal it. And if that returns true, I'm not sure which way around I want to do. We'll check that out in a second. See if my logic is sound. If it's the sum, it returns false. Okay. So if that returns false, then actually, well, you can make it simpler for yourself. You can just literally write, make it simpler. Check. I think we're missing a bracket as well. If you say that's false, just to make it explicit. Okay. If it's false, that means that they don't equal, therefore you should add it. Right, let's have a go. Now get used to coding being sort of roughly right on the concept and maybe so let's try 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, and 3. And it didn't seem to really do anything at all, did it? It just simply populated. Oh, hang on, that's because I've got only 3 values, so that's fairly useless. My test is actually quite useless. So to test this, what I might do is just pop that up to 4. So the 4th is a 6. Now what you'll notice in this process, and you should code this yourself and go through a similar process, is so 1, 2, 3. Now they add up to 6. So if I put in 6, it let me put 6 in. And that hasn't worked. We got it the wrong way around. So let's get rid of that equals false. Maybe somewhere in my logic is not quite sound, but this is something that you would spend time working out, your logic, and making sure that your mechanisms. And let's have a look. So we into 1, 2, 3, and let's try 6. Well, you can see it's failing already, and I didn't spot this. Those add up to 3. So that I shouldn't have been able to add that up as soon as I got there. So there's already an error in my code. So I'm going to leave it here for you to fix. So you can stop the video here. For the sake of my benefit, I'm going to just carry on and try to see what I did wrong. Now this is how I'm going to do it. I'm going to actually check what the values are and what things are being returned and what this condition is. So I'm going to put what's called a breakpoint. I'm going to hit the debug and I'm going to allow it to tell me. So I enter an integer, let's say 1. Interestingly, it hasn't gone there at all. What this means is that if I arrive at this statement here, so it isn't even going here at all. If I go to 2, it should be checking that statement, and it clearly isn't. So something in the logic of my code isn't sound. If I can see why. It's fairly obvious now that I've actually put that in, now that I've spotted that. That's one condition, but that's a separate condition. And the issue here is that we need to get the logic of these if statements right. That's not an else if. And so we need to be sure what we're actually talking about. And I mean, let's think about it. I say if to that one, and if that's true, it's going to skip all of that. So it's going to allow me to put combinations in because it's not going to even check. This if statement needs to be inside here. First of all, we need to check if it's not in the array. That's the first rule. Then within that rule, we then check that piece there before we add it. So this else statement is not the right place. So let's cut that from there, grab it all out of there. And inside this if statement, let's open up some space. So as long as they're unique, we're not going to add it. We're going to ask another question. Well, okay, they're unique, but is the combination not correct? Just check we've got all our brackets right. Now the logic makes more sense, and it should hopefully combine the logics. It's quite tricky what we're doing here, and it's quite useful, I hope, to you to see it. So if I do 2, that should be okay, but if I do 3, well, it should have given me a warning, and it hasn't given me a warning. If I do 6, it did work. Notice it put a 0 in, but again our logic failed us because we need this also within that if statement. We need it in 2 places. So now we start looking at now if you look, that number is not already, that number is already the combination of previous numbers is the same, right? And that's not permitted. That's what the rule says. Now look at the way that these loops, personally, I think what you would try to do at this stage, you've got one if statement with a logic, an external set of conditions, is look at how you can logically reduce that even further. But you notice that what we didn't do is drop the index, and we had the same problem that it just simply skipped past that and left a blank. We don't want it to leave a blank, we wanted to block it. So let's have a look. Right, so we go 1, 2, this should be blocked. It's already there, so you enter it again. So let's just say, I don't know, 4. So we'll end up with 1, 2, and 4. Please enter an integer. So if we say 7, it should block me. I say 6, it should be fine. So now we find that we're following the logic. Now I'm going to stop there, but the reason that I'm asking you to code this and spend some time with this and understand the coding concept is that you have a very simple populate array, but in populate array you notice it's just expanded. So actually what I would be looking at is breaking this down into logical subsections and creating functions to manage that. You are always trying to do this. In this type of programming, you're always trying to create functions which capture a concept. That some did help us, but maybe not enough. So that was relatively straightforward. Okay, that sum is relatively straightforward, so is that check value, but this one gets bloated. So we need to look at ways of how we can reduce that bloat, because what's the issue with it? It can get confusing, and watching this video you will have thought, hang on, that's not clear what's going on here, blah blah blah. So we need to think about how we would reduce the complexity. At this stage I won't, because I think when we come to object-oriented programming in more detail you will see strategies, but you need to learn this by testing this. So that's what I would do.